Ryan drove his car calmly through the familiar streets, heading home after a long day of studying at the library. He was a young man of 18, tall and thin, with dark skin and kind eyes that always seemed to smile. Ryan loved driving at night. The city lights shone like earthly stars, and the lighter traffic allowed him to enjoy the cityscape. He thought about the dinner his mother was probably preparing and the warm hug his father would give him when he got home. Suddenly, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Ryan frowned, confused. He was sure he wasn't driving too fast or breaking any traffic rules. Even so, he did what his father, Captain Thomas Porter, had always taught him. He signaled and pulled the car safely to the side of the road. With his heart beating a little faster, Ryan pulled out his cell phone and dialed his father's number. "Dad," he said when Thomas answered, "the police stopped me. I don't know why. What should I do?" Thomas's calm voice sounded on the other end of the line. "Don't worry, son. Be respectful and cooperate with the officer. Ask politely why you were stopped. If you feel something is wrong, ask to speak to me. I'm on my way." Ryan nodded, even though he knew his father couldn't see him. "Okay, Dad. Thanks." Meanwhile, in the patrol car behind Ryan, two officers watched the stopped vehicle. Sergeant Mike Green, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a bushy mustache, stared at Ryan's car. At his side was Terry, a rookie police officer of just 22 years old. Terry looked nervous, his eyes darting from Green to Ryan's car repeatedly. Sergeant Terry said hesitantly, "Why did we stop that car? I didn't see any violations." Green gave Terry a hard look. "Kid, I've been doing this job for 37 years. I know a criminal when I see one. That car is too expensive for someone like him to be driving in this neighborhood." Terry frowned, not liking what he was hearing. But before he could say anything, Green was already getting out of the car. Ryan saw the older officer approaching in his rearview mirror. He took a deep breath, remembering his father's words. "Be respectful, cooperate," he muttered to himself. Sergeant Green tapped on the window with his flashlight. Ryan rolled down the window, trying to stay calm. "Good evening, officer," Ryan said politely. "Can I help you?" Green looked at Ryan with hard eyes. "Car documents and your driver's license. Now." Ryan nodded, slowly reaching into the glove compartment to retrieve the car's documents. He then took his wallet from his pocket and handed everything over to the officer. Green examined the documents with a suspicious expression. "Ryan Porter," he read aloud. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this time of night?" Ryan swallowed hard. "I'm heading home, sir. I spent the day studying in the library." Green raised an eyebrow. "Studying? I know. Are there drugs or weapons in this car?" Ryan felt his heart speed up. "No, sir. Definitely not." At this moment, Terry approached. He could see the fear in Ryan's eyes and knew something was wrong with this situation. "Sergeant," Terry said quietly, "maybe we should." Green turned sharply. "Get back in the car, rookie. I've got this." Terry hesitated for a moment, looking from Ryan to Green. Finally, he lowered his head and returned to the patrol car. Green turned his attention to Ryan. "Get out of the car," he ordered. Ryan felt a knot in his stomach. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. Slowly, he opened the door and got out of the car. "Hands where I can see them," Green barked. Ryan raised his hands, feeling exposed and vulnerable on the dark sidewalk. Green began to search Ryan, his rough hands running through his pockets and legs. Ryan closed his eyes, hoping it would end soon. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires caught everyone's attention. A car stopped abruptly behind the police cruiser, and a familiar figure got out of it. Captain Thomas Porter, still wearing his uniform, walked quickly toward them. His eyes darted from Ryan to Green, a mix of worry and anger on his face. "What's going on here?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but firm. Green straightened up, surprised to see his superior. "Captain Porter, what are you doing here?" Thomas approached Ryan, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "This is my son, Sergeant Green. Now I ask again, what is going on here? Green paled, finally realizing his mistake. I thought he looked suspicious, sir. The car. Thomas raised a hand, interrupting Green. Suspicious? Based on what, exactly? Green stuttered, unable to come up with a suitable response. Thomas turned to Ryan. Son, are you okay? Ryan nodded, feeling relieved at his father's presence. I'm fine, Dad. Just a little scared. Thomas gently squeezed Ryan's shoulder before turning to Green. His eyes were hard as steel when he spoke. Sergeant Green, I want to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. We will discuss your actions tonight and the changes that need to be made in our district. Is that clear? Green swallowed. Yes, sir. Thomas then looked at Terry, who was standing near the patrol car, looking uncomfortable. Officer, do you have anything to add? Terry stepped forward, gathering his courage. Sir, I questioned the reason for the approach. I didn't see any infraction that would justify us stopping the car. Thomas nodded, a faint smile of approval on his lips. Thank you for your honesty, officer. It's good to see that some of our new recruits understand the true meaning of serving and protecting. Turning to Ryan, Thomas said softly, Let's go home, son. Your mother must be worried. Ryan nodded, taking the keys that Green had silently handed back to him. As he got into his car, he saw his father speaking a few more words to the two police officers. Terry looked relieved, while Green had his head down, shame evident in his posture. When Thomas returned to his own car, Ryan started the engine. He followed his father down the street, leaving behind the scene of the injustice he had almost suffered. No con patrol. Terry glanced at Green, who looked as if he had aged 10 years in the last few minutes. You know, Sergeant, Terry said softly, my grandmother always said that when we judge someone, it says more about us than it does about the person we're judging. Green looked at Terry, the initial anger in his eyes slowly giving way to reluctant understanding. Maybe, he murmured, even an old dog can learn some new tricks. Sergeant Mike Green stepped out of the patrol car, his heavy footsteps echoing on the silent sidewalk. The night was quiet, but inside him, a storm of emotions was stirring. His eyes, hardened from years of service, fixed on Ryan's car. Terry, the young police officer, watched the scene with a knot in his stomach. Something didn't feel right. He wanted to say something, do something, but the words stuck in his throat. Ryan saw the older officer approaching in his rearview mirror. His heart was beating fast, but he remembered his father's words, be respectful, cooperate. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself for what came next. Green tapped on the window with his flashlight, the sound echoing in the silent night. Ryan rolled down the window, trying to stay calm. Good evening, Officer, Ryan said, his voice shaking slightly. Can I help you? Green looked at Ryan, his eyes hard and cold. Car documents and your driver's license, now. Ryan nodded, his movements slow and careful as he reached for the glove compartment. He could feel Green's eyes following his every move, like a predator watching its prey. Here they are, Sir, Ryan said, handing over the documents with shaking hands. Green looked over the papers, his expression a mixture of distrust and something else. Something Ryan couldn't quite place, but that made his stomach turn. Ryan Porter, Green read aloud, his voice thick with suspicion. What are you doing in this neighborhood at this time of night? Ryan swallowed hard, feeling like he was on trial for a crime he didn't commit. I'm heading home, sir. I spent the day studying in the library. Green raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying the explanation. Studying? I know. Are there drugs or weapons in this car? The question hit Ryan like a punch in the gut. He felt a mixture of fear and indignation rising within him. No, sir. Definitely not, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. At this moment, Terry approached. He could see the fear in Ryan's eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Something inside him screamed that this was wrong. Sergeant, Terry said quietly, trying to get Green's attention. Maybe we should. Green turned sharply, his eyes flashing with anger. Get back in the car, rookie. I've got this. Terry hesitated, his gaze moving from Ryan to Green, He knew he should obey his superior, but something in his heart told him that remaining silent would be wrong. But Sergeant Terry insisted, summoning all his courage. "We haven't seen any violations. Maybe we should just—" "I said get back in the car," Green growled, his voice thick with authority and menace. Terry took a step back, feeling defeated. With one last apologetic look at Ryan, he returned to the patrol car, his heart heavy with the guilt of not having done more. Green turned his attention to Ryan, his eyes shining with frightening determination. "Get out of the car," he ordered. Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. Slowly he opened the door and got out of the car, the cold night air making him shiver. "Hands where I can see them," Green barked, his voice cutting through the silence of the night. Ryan raised his hands, feeling exposed and vulnerable on the dark sidewalk. He could feel the curious gazes of neighbors through the windows, silent witnesses to his humiliation. Green began searching Ryan, his rough hands running through his pockets and legs. Ryan closed his eyes, wishing it would be over soon, that he could go back to the safety of his car, his home, his normal life. "What are you really doing here?" Boy Green asked, his voice thick with accusation. "This is not a neighborhood for people like you." The words hit Ryan like a slap. People like me, he thought, anger and sadness mixing in his chest. He wanted to scream, to protest, to tell Sergeant Green that he had as much right to be there as anyone else. But his father's words echoed in his mind: "Be respectful, cooperate." "I live here," Sir Ryan said, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "My family has lived in this neighborhood for generations." Green looked surprised for a moment, but soon his face hardened again. "Don't lie to me, kid. I know your type." Always has an excuse on the tip of his tongue. Ryan felt tears burning in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give Green the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires cut through the night. A car stopped abruptly behind the police cruiser, and a familiar figure got out of it. Captain Thomas Porter, still wearing his uniform, walked quickly towards them. His eyes darted from Ryan to Green, a mix of worry and anger on his face. "What's going on here?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but full of authority. Green straightened up, surprise and confusion evident on his face. "Captain Porter, what are you doing here?" Thomas approached Ryan, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. His father's touch was like a balm to Ryan, calming his racing heart. "This is my son, Sergeant Green," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Now I ask again, what's going on here?" Green paled, the realization of his mistake finally hitting him. I thought he looked suspicious, sir. The car." Thomas raised a hand, interrupting Green. His usually gentle eyes now shone with an intensity that made Green flinch. "Suspicious," Thomas repeated, his voice thick with disbelief and disappointment. "Based on what exactly, Sergeant? The color of my son's skin? The car he drives? Or perhaps the neighborhood where we choose to live?" Green stuttered, unable to find the words to defend himself. Shame and regret were beginning to settle on his face. Thomas turned to Ryan, his expression softening. "Son, are you okay?" Ryan nodded, feeling safe for the first time since being stopped. "I'm fine, Dad. Just a little scared." Thomas gently squeezed Ryan's shoulder before turning to Green. His eyes were hard as steel when he spoke. "Sergeant Green, I want to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. We will discuss your actions tonight and the changes that need to be made in our district. Is that clear?" Green swallowed hard, looking smaller than ever. "Yes, sir." Thomas then looked at Terry, who was standing near the patrol car, looking a mix of relief and guilt. "Officer, do you have anything to add?" Terry stepped forward, summoning all his courage. "Sir, I questioned the reason for the approach. I didn't see any infraction that would justify us stopping the car. I should have insisted more." Thomas nodded, a faint smile of approval on his lips. "Thank you for your honesty, officer. It's good to see that some of our new recruits understand the true meaning of serving and protecting. Never be afraid to do what's right, even if it means defying authority. Turning to Ryan, Thomas said softly, "Let's go home, son. Your mother must be worried." Ryan nodded, taking the keys that Green had silently handed back to him. As he got into his car, he saw his father speaking a few more words to the two police officers. Terry looked relieved, while Green had his head down, shame evident in his posture. When Thomas returned to his own car, Ryan started the engine. He followed his father down the street, leaving behind the scene of the injustice he had almost suffered. But Green's words still echoed in his mind, "This isn't a neighborhood for people like you." Ryan knew that tonight would change a lot of things. For him, for his father, for the police department. But as he drove home, he wondered if he would really change people's hearts. If one day he could walk the streets of his own city without being seen as a threat. With these thoughts heavy on his mind, Ryan followed his father into the night, longing for the comfort and safety of home, but knowing that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. The sun had barely risen when Captain Thomas Porter arrived at the police station. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, his mind filled with thoughts of the previous night's events. He stopped in front of his room, took a deep breath and entered. Minutes later, a soft knock sounded on the door. "Come in," Thomas said, his voice firm. Sergeant Mike Green entered, looking as if he had aged 10 years since the night before. His eyes, usually full of confidence, were now lowered, avoiding the captain's gaze. "Sit down," Sergeant Thomas said, pointing to the chair in front of his desk. Green sat down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Silence weighed in the room like a heavy cloud. Mike Thomas began, his voice softer than Green expected. "We've worked together for a long time. I've always respected you as a police officer and as a person. So I want to understand, what happened last night?" Green looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze. I made a mistake, Captain. A terrible mistake." Thomas nodded, encouraging Green to continue. "When I saw that expensive car in that neighborhood, I made assumptions. Assumptions based on prejudices I didn't even know I had." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Green. "And those assumptions almost led you to commit a grave injustice against my son. Against an innocent young man who did nothing wrong other than drive home." Green hung his head, shame evident in his posture. "I know, Captain, and there are no words to express how much I regret it." Thomas stood up, walking to the window. He looked at the city he swore to protect, thinking of his son, of all the young people who faced similar situations every day. "Mike," he said finally, turning to face the sergeant, "what happened last night is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that we have ignored for too long." Green nodded, his expression a mix of regret and understanding. "You're right, Captain. I never realized before, but now I see that my behavior wasn't a one-off." Thomas returned to his chair, his eyes fixed on Green. "What do you think we should do about this, Sergeant?" Green hesitated for a moment, then straightened his shoulders. "We need changes, Captain. Training, education, we need to do better." Thomas smiled slightly, satisfied with the answer. "Exactly, Mike. And that's where you come in." Green looked at Thomas, confused. "Me, sir." Thomas nodded. "You made a mistake, Mike. A big one. But you're willing to acknowledge it and learn from it. I want you to lead our new anti-racial bias training initiative." Green gaped. "Me? But Captain, after what I did." "Precisely because of what you did," Thomas interrupted. "Who better to teach about the dangers of prejudice than someone who has recognized their own mistakes and is willing to change?" Green was silent for a moment, absorbing Thomas' words. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do my best, Captain. I promise." Thomas smiled. "I know you will, Mike. Now there's one more thing I need you to do." Meanwhile, at the Porter house, Ryan was sitting at the kitchen table, playing with his breakfast. His mother, Sarah, watched him with concern. "Honey," she said softly, "do you want to talk about what happened last night?" Ryan looked up, a sad smile on his lips. "What's there to talk about, Mom? I got pulled over by the cops for being black in the wrong neighborhood. It's nothing new." Sarah sat next to her son, taking his hand. "It may not be new, Ryan, but that doesn't mean it's right. Your father is working to change things." Ryan nodded, squeezing his mother's hand. "I know, Mom. It's just. Sometimes it feels like no matter what we do, how we dress, how we act, some people will always see us as a threat." Sarah felt her heart sink at her son's words. She was about to respond when the doorbell rang. Ryan frowned. Who could it be at this hour? Sarah got up to answer the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Sergeant Green standing there, looking uncomfortable in his uniform. "Mrs. Porter," Green said, tipping his hat, "can I speak to Ryan, please?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Ryan, honey, can you come here for a minute?" Ryan appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening when he saw Green. "Sergeant," he said, his voice cautious. Green swallowed hard, then spoke. "Ryan, I came to apologize. My behavior last night was unacceptable. I made judgments based on biases I didn't even know I had, and it almost led to a terrible injustice." Ryan was silent, watching the man in front of him. Green continued. "I know my words cannot undo what happened or erase the fear and humiliation you felt. But I want you to know that I am committed to doing better, to being better." Ryan looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. He turned to Green. "Thank you for your apology, Sergeant. It means a lot to me." Green smiled slightly, relief evident on his face. "Your father gave me a second chance, Ryan. A chance to lead a new anti-racial bias training program in our department, and I'd like to ask for your help." Ryan frowned in surprise. "My help?" Green nodded. "Yes, your perspective, your experience. They are invaluable. With your permission, I would like to use what happened yesterday as a case study in our training, to show other officers how bias can affect our judgment and lead to unjust actions." Ryan was silent for a moment, thinking. Finally he spoke. "You know, Sergeant, last night when you stopped me, I felt helpless, like my voice didn't matter. But now, you're giving me the chance to use my voice to make a difference." Green smiled, hope shining in his eyes. "So do you accept?" Ryan held out his hand. "Yes, Sergeant, I accept." Green shook Ryan's hand, gratitude evident on his face. "Thank you, Ryan. I promise I won't waste this opportunity." When Green left, Sarah hugged her son. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered. Ryan smiled, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be more challenges and obstacles, but for the first time he felt like his voice could really make a difference. That night, when Thomas returned home, he found Ryan on the porch, looking at the stars. "How are you, son?" Thomas asked, sitting down next to Ryan. Ryan smiled at his father. "I'm fine, Dad. In fact, I'm better than fine. You know, for a long time I felt powerless in the face of prejudice. But today I realize that I have the power to make a difference. To change things, even if it's a little at a time." Thomas hugged his son, pride evident in his eyes. "You've always had this power, Ryan, and I'm so proud to see you use it." Together, father and son looked up at the starry sky, their hearts full of hope for the future. They knew the journey would be long, but they were ready to face it, one step at a time, one mind at a time, until one day perhaps everyone could be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their lives, its character. The sun rose over the city, its golden rays illuminating the still sleepy streets. At the police station, an atmosphere of expectation hung in the air. It was the day of the first training against racial prejudice, led by Sergeant Mike Green. Green was standing in front of the training room, his impeccable uniform contrasting with the nervous expression on his face. He looked at the audience of officers, some curious, some skeptical. At the back of the room he saw Captain Thomas Porter and, to his surprise, Ryan. Taking a deep breath, Green began, "Good morning, everyone. We're here today to talk about a difficult but crucial subject, racial bias in our police force." A murmur ran through the room. Green continued, "A week ago, I made a serious mistake. A mistake that could have had dire consequences. And today, with the help of Ryan Porter, I want to share that experience with you." Ryan stood up and walked to the front of the room, stopping next to Green. His eyes roved over the faces of the officers, some familiar, some strangers, all attentive. "My name is Ryan Porter," he began, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "A week ago, I was stopped by the police on my way home. Not for committing an infraction, but for being black, driving an expensive car in a neighborhood someone decided I didn't belong in." The silence in the room was palpable. Ryan continued, describing in detail the experience of the fateful night. He talked about fear, humiliation, the feeling of helplessness. When he finished, he saw tears in the eyes of some officers, shock on the faces of others. Green took the floor again. "What happened to Ryan is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of deeply rooted biases in our society, biases that we often don't even realize we have." He then led the officers through a series of exercises and discussions. They analyzed cases of police stops, discussed statistics on arrests and use of force, and reflected on their own experiences and prejudices. At the end of the day, Green concluded, "Our job is to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of their color, race, or origin. Starting today, let's commit to doing better, to being better." When the session ended, many officers approached Ryan, some to apologize, others to thank him for sharing his story. Ryan felt overwhelmed, but also hopeful. Thomas approached his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said softly. Ryan smiled at his father, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and accomplishment. "Thanks, Dad. Do you think we made a difference today?" Thomas looked around, seeing the groups of officers still arguing animatedly. "I think so, Ryan. It's a start." In the weeks that followed, Ryan continued to participate in training, sharing his perspective and helping to shape the program. He saw changes happening, small but significant. Officers approaching situations with more empathy, communities beginning to trust the police more. One day, as Ryan was driving home after a training session, he saw siren lights in his rearview mirror. For a moment, he felt the old fear resurface. But when he pulled over, he saw it was Terry, the young officer who had been with Green that fateful night. Terry approached the car, a friendly smile on his face. "Good afternoon, Ryan. Sorry to stop you like that, but I wanted to thank you in person. What you're doing, it's changing things. It's changing us." Ryan felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Terry. It means a lot." When Terry walked away, Ryan sat in his car for a moment, reflecting. He thought about how a terrible night had turned into an opportunity for change. He thought about Green, about Terry, about all the officers who were trying to do better. That night at home, Ryan found his parents on the porch. He joined them, watching the sunset paint the sky pink and orange. "How was today?" Sarah asked, wrapping an arm around her son's shoulders. Ryan smiled. "It felt good, Mom. We're making progress." Thomas nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "You know, Ryan, when I joined the police force, I dreamed of making a difference. But I never imagined that it would be my son who would really change things." Ryan felt tears in his eyes. "It's not just me, Dad, it's all of us. Green, Terry, you. Everyone who is willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to improve." Sarah kissed her son's forehead. "You're right, darling. Change happens one heart at a time, one mind at a time." As night fell, the Porter family sat in silence, contemplating the future. They knew the road ahead would still be long and difficult, that there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But they also knew that they had taken their first steps towards a better world, a world where people would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, a world where the police and the community could work together in harmony. Ryan looked up at the stars that were beginning to dot the night sky. He thought of all the lives that could be saved, all the injustices that could be avoided, and for the first time in a long time he felt something he had lost on that fateful night: hope. He knew the work was just beginning, that there would be difficult days ahead, moments of doubt and discouragement. But looking at his parents, remembering Terry's words, Green's commitment, Ryan knew he wasn't alone on this journey. "You know," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I think I finally understand what it means to truly serve and protect." Thomas and Sarah looked at their son curiously. Ryan continued, it's not just about enforcing the law. It's about building bridges, creating understanding. It's about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. You're right, son. And that's what we're going to keep doing, one day at a time. As the night progressed, the Porter family remained on the porch, talking, laughing, planning the future. They knew they had started something important, something that could change not just their city, but perhaps one day the entire world. And so, under the starry sky, a new story began to be written. A story of courage, of compassion, of change. A story that proved that, even in the most difficult situations, kindness and justice could prevail. Ryan fell asleep that night with a heart full of hope and determination. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new opportunity to make a difference. And he was ready to face it, not just for himself, but for all those who would come after him. The future, he knew, was full of possibilities. And with every small step, every difficult conversation, every open mind, they were moving closer to a more just and equal world. A world where everyone could feel safe, respected, and valued. And that, Ryan thought as he closed his eyes, was worth every effort, every challenge. Because in the end, that's what really mattered, creating a better world for everyone.